At 6:19 a.m., the Caribbean Sea appeared calm and undisturbed. The USS George Washington carrier strike group moved steadily north, cutting through smooth blue water under a clear morning sky. On the flight deck, sailors went about routine tasks, the kind performed thousands of times before, checking equipment, guiding deck operations, and preparing for another uneventful day at sea. Nothing about the moment suggested what was about to unfold. Then, on the distant horizon, two small shapes emerged. At first, they were barely visible, shimmering in the early sunlight as heat distorted the air above the ocean, but they were moving fast, far too fast to be civilian aircraft. As the seconds passed, the dots grew larger, closing the distance with deliberate speed. The low rumble of jet engines carried across the water, breaking the quiet rhythm of the morning. Heads turned, movements slowed, sailors paused mid-task as instinct took over. The aircraft burst into view at extremely low altitude, skimming just a few thousand feet above the sea. They were Venezuelan military jets approaching aggressively without any prior radio contact or warning. The jets banked sharply and crossed the carrier's bow in a high-speed pass, close enough to be unmistakable. It was a classic intimidation maneuver, a buzzing run meant to send a message rather than deliver weapons. From the bridge of the carrier, the commanding officer observed the flyby through binoculars. His expression did not change. The massive warship did not alter course, slow down, or react outwardly in any way. The order was short and firm: maintain heading and speed. As the jets climbed away, their afterburners flared briefly, leaving trails of exhaust that glowed in the early light. The manoeuvre was dangerous, performed too low, too fast, and far too close to a 100,000-ton nuclear-powered carrier whose sensors could track far smaller objects from far greater distances. Below deck, in the Combat Information Center, radar and infrared systems had already captured every second of the encounter. The aircraft were clearly identified. Their hardpoints appeared empty. This was not an attack run. It was theatre, an aerial dare conducted at the edge of safety. Yet in naval aviation, such moments are never trivial. A single misjudgment, a minor error in timing or spacing, can turn a show of force into an international crisis. And as the jets turned back toward the Venezuelan coast, the encounter seemed, briefly, to be over, without anyone realizing that it was only the opening move. For a brief moment after the first flyby, it appeared that the incident had ended as quickly as it began. The two Venezuelan jets climbed away from the carrier strike group and turned back toward the mainland, their exhaust trails fading into the pale Caribbean sky. On the surface, it looked like a single act of intimidation, reckless but contained. Beneath that appearance, however, the situation was already changing. Inside the USS George Washington's Combat Information Center, the atmosphere remained focused and controlled. Radar operators continued tracking the departing aircraft while air controllers reviewed their flight profiles and communications, or the lack of them. The jets had not responded to standard hails, nor had they identified themselves through established military channels. That silence mattered. In aviation and naval operations, communication is often the clearest indicator of intent. Just minutes later, the radar picture shifted again. New contacts appeared on the scopes, emerging from a different vector and climbing rapidly. At first glance, the operators assumed sensor lag or duplicated tracks. But as the data stabilized, the reality became clear. There were now 4 aircraft, not 2, converging on the carrier strike group. The room grew quieter, not tense, but deliberate. The watch officer leaned closer to the plotting table as operators confirmed headings, altitude and speed. Identification friend or foe systems returned no cooperative signals. These aircraft were not simply passing through, they were approaching with intent, coordinated in a way that suggested planning rather than coincidence. Above deck, the carrier's routine posture shifted seamlessly. Air wing crews moved with practiced efficiency, preparing fighters for immediate launch. There was no visible alarm, no rush, just a smooth transition from peacetime routine to defensive readiness. This was not escalation, it was posture. From a strategic perspective, the meaning of the moment was clear. A single flyby can be dismissed as bravado. A second approach by additional aircraft transforms the encounter into something else entirely. It signals testing of reactions, of rules of engagement, of discipline. The USS George Washington did not change course or speed. That decision carried its own message. For decades, American carrier doctrine has relied on consistency under pressure. Movement suggests uncertainty. Stillness signals control. What appeared to the outside world as a brief aerial stunt was now evolving into a structured challenge. And while no weapons were visible and no shots had been fired, the margin for error was narrowing rapidly. In the air, seconds matter, and with 4 unidentified military aircraft closing in, the encounter had crossed from provocation into a serious operational test. With 4 unidentified military aircraft now converging on the carrier strike group, the situation shifted decisively from observation to action. Inside the USS George Washington's Combat Information Center, procedures moved from monitoring to execution. The watch officer confirmed the tracks one final time. Speed high, altitude increasing, formation tight. There was no ambiguity left. This was a coordinated approach. The order was given calmly and without hesitation. Launch interceptors. On the flight deck, air wing crews snapped into motion with precision born of repetition. 2 FA-18 Super Hornets were rolled forward to the catapults, their wings unfolding as deck crews guided them into position. Yellow shirt directors signalled steam built and final checks were completed in seconds. There was no sense of urgency or panic, only practiced efficiency. This was exactly what the carrier was designed to do. As the catapult fired, each Hornet launched in a violent burst of noise and motion, streaking off the bow and climbing rapidly into the morning sky. Within moments, both aircraft were airborne and accelerating toward the incoming radar contacts. Their mission was clearly defined: intercept, identify and de-escalate if possible. Weapons remained on standby. This was not an offensive response. It was a defensive assertion of control over the airspace. Back in the Combat Information Center, the tactical picture expanded. Data from the carrier's radar systems flowed seamlessly into the Hornets' cockpits through secure data links, providing real-time updates on speed, altitude and vector. At the same time, escorting destroyers adjusted their position slightly, tightening the defensive screen around the carrier without altering its course or speed. To an outside observer, the launch of fighter jets might appear provocative. Within naval aviation doctrine, it was the opposite. Intercepting unknown aircraft early and at distance reduces risk. It creates space for identification and communication before proximity becomes dangerous. The USS George Washington continued forward at a steady pace, its massive presence unshaken. The message was unspoken but unmistakable. The carrier would not maneuver in response to intimidation, but it would defend itself with absolute readiness. As the Super Hornets climbed through thousands of feet, sunlight flashing off their fuselages, the encounter entered a new phase, one where control of the sky, not the sea, would determine how far the confrontation might go. As the 2 FA-18 Super Hornets climbed through 15,000 feet, the Caribbean sky opened wide before them. From this altitude, the USS George Washington appeared as a small grey outline on the water below, flanked by her destroyers in a precise defensive formation. Above, the air was clear, the horizon stretching endlessly east and west, but the calm was deceptive. Inside the cockpit of the lead Hornet, the pilot, callsign Viper 1, studied his radar display. 4 solid contacts glowed on the screen, maintaining tight spacing and steady speed. There was no doubt now. These were Venezuelan military aircraft approaching deliberately and without coordination through established airspace control channels. The data streaming into the cockpit from the carrier's radar systems confirmed every detail. Altitude, vector, closure rate, updated in real time. The Hornets angled toward the incoming formation, closing the distance quickly but deliberately. This was not a chase. It was an intercept designed to assert presence and force clarity before the situation became dangerous. As the aircraft drew within visual range, sunlight reflected sharply off the smaller jets ahead, their silhouettes cutting clean lines against the blue sky. Unidentified military aircraft Viper 1 transmitted calmly over the International Air Distress frequency. You're approaching a United States carrier strike group operating in international airspace. Identify yourself and state your intentions. For a moment there was only static, then a response came through, short, accented and defiant. The Venezuelan pilot claimed the Americans were violating national airspace and ordered them to turn away. The exchange confirmed what commanders already suspected. This was not confusion, it was confrontation. The Venezuelan jets altered course slightly, cutting across the Hornet's flight path at high speed. The maneuver was aggressive but controlled, close enough to trigger proximity alerts in the American pilot's helmet displays. Inside the cockpit, muscle memory took over. Grip steady, throttle smooth, no sudden movements. The Hornets did not react outwardly. They did not lock radar. They did not maneuver defensively. Instead, they slid into a shadowing position, matching speed and altitude, recording every movement. This was restraint by design. Every second of data mattered. Below them, unseen but ever present, the USS George Washington continued on course, her sensors tracking the unfolding encounter with perfect clarity. The sky had become the new front line, not for missiles or guns, but for discipline, judgment and control. As the American Super Hornet settled into a shadowing position, the tone of the encounter shifted once again. What had begun as aggressive posturing now edged closer to genuine danger. The Venezuelan jets tightened their formation, drifting closer to one another while subtly adjusting altitude and heading. Their movements were no longer merely demonstrative. They were testing boundaries. Inside the cockpit, Viper 1 watched the spacing carefully. The distance between aircraft was shrinking to levels that left little room for error. At these speeds, approaching high subsonic, even minor miscalculations could result in catastrophic collision. The American pilots remained calm, their voices steady over secure channels, narrating every maneuver for the record. One of the Venezuelan jets suddenly banked hard, cutting across the Hornet's nose at less than 800 meters. The proximity warning flashed briefly on the helmet display, then disappeared as the aircraft passed through the danger zone. The maneuver was reckless, violating basic flight safety standards used by military aviators worldwide. Maintain shadow posture, came the calm instruction from fleet control. Record everything. Below, aboard the USS George Washington, the Combat Information Center tracked the engagement in real time. On large digital displays, 4 red icons twisted and crossed above the blue outline of the strike group. The carrier's advanced radar systems plotted every turn with mathematical precision. To the systems, there was no chaos, only data. As the Venezuelan jets descended slightly, their shadows rippled across the ocean surface far below. The symbolism was impossible to miss. They were flying just close enough to provoke a reaction, yet stopping short of an action that would justify immediate engagement. It was a calculated gamble, one that relied on the assumption that the Americans would eventually flinch. They did not. The Hornets held position, engine steady, weapons silent, no radar locks were initiated, no counter maneuvers signalled escalation. This restraint was not hesitation, it was doctrine. Every unnecessary reaction increased the risk of misinterpretation, yet the danger was real. With each aggressive pass, the margin for error narrowed. A sudden gust, a mechanical fault, or a pilot's nerves could transform theatre into tragedy. In that thin slice of air above the Caribbean, the encounter balanced precariously between deterrence and disaster, held together only by discipline on one side and calculation on the other. The situation reached its most perilous moment when one of the Venezuelan jets abruptly broke formation. Without warning, the aircraft rolled sharply to the left, inverted briefly, and then pitched downward into a steep dive toward the carrier strike group below. The maneuver was aggressive, fast, and dangerously low, far beyond what could be dismissed as routine posturing. The second jet followed moments later, mirroring the dive as both aircraft descended rapidly, their shadows stretching across the water beneath them. From the bridge of the USS George Washington, the movement was unmistakable. This was no longer a distant aerial demonstration. The jets were now closing directly on the heart of the formation, inside the Combat Information Center. Range and altitude readings began to drop quickly. Operators called out updates in clipped, precise language. The carrier's radar systems tracked the descending aircraft with flawless clarity, calculating vectors and closure rates faster than any human could process. The data told a stark story. If the jets continued on their current path, they would cross within seconds of the carrier and her escorts. Defensive systems reacted automatically. Close-in weapon systems shifted from passive monitoring to warm standby. Sensors slewed toward the incoming tracks, following every adjustment in pitch and speed. Yet even now, no weapons were fired, no locks were announced. The restraint held. Over the radio, the Super Hornet pilots continued to shadow the Venezuelan aircraft, their voices steady despite the rapidly unfolding danger. Cameras captured every frame. Every second of the dive was being recorded, analysed and archived. At this distance, the consequences of error were unforgiving. A misjudged pull-up, a moment of vertigo, or a mechanical failure could send an aircraft crashing into the sea, or worse, into a ship below. The difference between provocation and catastrophe had narrowed to a handful of heartbeats. Still, the USS George Washington did not alter course. The carrier held 20 knots, heading unchanged. This was not stubbornness, it was doctrine. A US carrier does not maneuver under pressure unless force is unavoidable. As the jets roared past the outer edge of the formation, engines screaming and wake turbulence rippling across the water, the entire strike group hovered on the brink of escalation. The systems were ready, the weapons were aligned, and yet the order remained the same. Hold! In that moment, judgment, not firepower, was the decisive force keeping the encounter from crossing a line no one truly wanted to breach. The next few seconds unfolded with frightening speed. One of the Venezuelan jets surged forward, passing over the bow of the American destroyer at extreme speed. The shockwave rolled across the sea surface like thunder, rattling antennas and vibrating deck plating. Almost immediately after, the aircraft crossed dangerously close to one of the Super Hornets, missing it by mere hundreds of feet. In aviation terms, it was a near miss, an event that could have ended lives in an instant. Inside the cockpit, the American pilot's training took over completely. There was no instinctive, evasive maneuver, no sudden throttle change. The Hornet held its line steady and controlled as the Venezuelan jet streaked past. Any abrupt reaction could have escalated the situation or caused a collision. Discipline mattered now more than speed or firepower. Below, aboard the USS George Washington, the Combat Information Center tracked the encounter with clinical precision. The carrier's sensors measured distances down to the meter, updating positions multiple times per second. Close-in weapon systems remained locked onto the airspace, but silent, their barrels following the aircraft automatically. Every safeguard was in place. Only one thing was missing: the command to fire. For a moment, the encounter balanced on the edge of catastrophe. Both sides were operating within inches of disaster, separated only by judgment and restraint. The Venezuelan pilots continued their aggressive flight path, pushing the limits of safety, perhaps hoping to force a reaction that could be framed as provocation. It never came. The American response remained unchanged. No radar locks, no warning shots, no evasive turns. The Super Hornet slid back into shadow position, maintaining visual contact without challenging the Venezuelans' movements. This quiet confidence sent a message far more powerful than any flare or missile. Then, just as suddenly as it had intensified, the tension began to release. The Venezuelan jets pulled up and banked away, their engines fading as they turned toward the southern horizon. The near miss had not achieved escalation. It had achieved clarity. The strike group remained intact, unshaken and steady on course. In those final seconds, the difference between an international crisis and a controlled disengagement came down to one factor alone: discipline under pressure. As the Venezuelan jets began to pull away, the tension in the sky did not immediately disappear. One aircraft lingered longer than the others, circling wide as if unwilling to fully disengage. On the radar displays aboard the USS George Washington, operators watched the contact carefully, tracking every subtle change in speed and altitude. The aircraft remained within range, close enough to matter. Then, for a brief moment, something changed. Electronic warfare sensors aboard the carrier registered a short, sharp spike. One of the Venezuelan jets had activated its targeting radar, briefly painting the carrier strike group. The pulse lasted only seconds, but its meaning was unmistakable. In military aviation, activating a fire control or targeting radar is not a casual act. It signals intent. It is the step that comes just before weapons employment. Inside the Combat Information Center, the reaction was immediate but controlled. The radar emission was logged, time-stamped and analysed. Systems automatically assessed threat parameters and readiness levels, adjusted quietly in the background, yet no alarms sounded. No countermeasures were launched. The carrier did not manoeuvre. This restraint was deliberate. Under established rules of engagement, the carrier strike group was fully justified in responding. A radar lock, even a brief one, can be interpreted as hostile intent, but commanders chose discipline over demonstration. They understood that escalation at this stage would not increase safety, it would only validate the provocation. Minutes later, the Venezuelan jets faded from radar entirely, retreating toward the mainland. The physical confrontation was over, but the encounter was far from finished. Within the hour, Venezuelan state media began broadcasting grainy footage of the flybys, framing the incident as a successful assertion of national sovereignty. Claims circulated that American forces had been forced to retreat. The narrative moved quickly, unconcerned with accuracy or context. The reality, recorded in precise data logs and flight records, told a different story. The USS George Washington never altered course or speed. The jets had come close, but not close enough to force a response. What followed was no longer a test of aircraft or radar systems. It was a contest of perception, and in that contest, silence, data and restraint became the most powerful tools of all.